Good morning, everyone. My name is Shirley Roebuck, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors for the Ontario Health Coalition, and I also chair local coalitions in southwestern Ontario. This session is titled Victory Against For-Profit Clinics in a British Columbia Court Challenge and What is Next. This court challenge threatened not only BC's public health system, but it would have, it can open doors for dire implications for the rest of Canada. All of our panelists today helped lead the fight to protect our rights, and we're going to hear about the impact of winning that court challenge. Again, if you have a question or a point for discussion, we ask that you put it in the chat. That's at the lower bar from if you're on a PC or Mac, and for iPads, apparently it's at the top. We will try to get to as many questions as we can in the Q&A session, which will follow the panelists' presentations. Please note if you are directing a question or your point to one speaker in particular or to everyone. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce you to our panel on the victory against for-profit clinics and what's next. Dr. Danyaal Raza is a physician and the chair of Canadian Doctors for Medicare. He has been an incredible leader in advocacy for single-tier public health care. Canadian Doctors for Medicare were intervenors in the court challenge. Dr. Raza, thank you so much for being here. And you are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you, Shirley, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm just trying to share my screen, and it's saying it's disabled. Could I have it enabled? Okay, beautiful. All right, here we go. All right, can everyone see my slides, see my face? We're good to go? Okay, great. So thank you so much. There's three of us speaking, and the way we've kind of set it up is we're each gonna kind of take a chunk out of this because it was a huge case and there's a lot to talk about. So we're gonna try and get the most out of our time together. So I wear a few different hats. I'm a family doctor at St. Mike's Hospital in Toronto, but I'm also the board chair of Canadian Doctors for Medicare. We're a physician advocacy group from coast to coast to coast that pushes for evidence-based, values-driven healthcare reform. And along with the BC Health Coalition, we were intervenors in this case, which meant we had legal status in the court, and we were able to present evidence through our lawyers. Okay, so I'm going to do two things in this kind of these very brief remarks before we get into the Q&A, which I think will be very interesting. The first is just talk about like, how did this case start? What's the history that got us here today? And then in a big sense, talk what part of privatization, because obviously privatization can involve many things, what part of privatization within the healthcare system was this case about? And then Usman from the BCHC, who's after me, is going to talk about some of the specifics of the case itself. So the main spokesperson and the kind of the lead plaintiff within the case, the folks on the other side, is this orthopedic surgeon named Brian Day, and he is one of the owners and operators of the Cambie Surgical Center, which is a private for-profit surgical center in Vancouver. I mean, he's got quite a history. He was the president of the Canadian Medical Association from 2007 and 2008. In fact, he was one of the reasons that our organization, CDM, came to be. And he has always been a very vocal advocate for both private funding and for-profit delivery of healthcare. It was kind of an open secret that for some time his clinic was openly violating the laws on extra billing, on charging both patients and the public system for care, and allowing the folks who were able to do this to jump the queue or jump to the front of the line for surgical procedures. And in 2008, he decided that kind of doing this in the shadows wasn't enough, and he and his clinic launched a charter challenge. So they launched a legal challenge based on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, claiming that extra billing was a restriction and a deprivation of patients' rights, specifically Section 7, which is the right to life, liberty, and the security of the person. And in doing so, challenged BC's Medicare Protection Act, which was the provincial version of the Canada Health Act. So remember, 2008, that was 12 years ago when this kind of first started. And in kind of the lead up and the preparation to the case, the Cambie Surgical Center was audited by the BC government, and in a period of 30 days, just 30 days, they were found to be billing patients $500,000 in extra billing. So this is both billing the government for a surgical procedure, and then on top of that, billing patients $500,000 in total over a 30-day period. It's just a single month. So pretty substantive. Their legal challenge really challenged three things, and I'm going to leave this for Usman to get into, but three specific things within the BC Medical Protection Act. And so after the case being launched in 2008, after a lot of delays, a lot of back and forth, it actually started in front of the court, in front of the judge in September of 2016. And it wrapped up 4 years later. You know, this was a BC Supreme Court case, but even by that standards, it was a very long and prolonged case. So it took 4 years to wrap up. And the judgment was released in September, this past September, so not that long ago. And I don't think this is a spoiler alert. Won the case. Yeah. Oh, it was such a wonderful day when that news came out. And we didn't just win, it was a very decisive, we didn't just win, it was a very decisive victory. And we could talk about how decisive it was later. But we're also not at the end of the story, right? We know the plaintiffs, the Cambie Center and Brian Day are launching an appeal. So though this was a really significant milestone, we're not done with the case quite yet, but there is still reason for us to celebrate. Okay, so I'm just going to take a quick step back and talk about, you know, within the broader move towards privatizing the healthcare system, where does this case fit in, right? And what do we mean when we're saying private, public, for-profit, not-for-profit? Because it can get confusing at times. So when we use the words, or at least when I use the words public versus private, we can use it to refer to two things, right? Either the financing of the healthcare system, so who's actually paying for the healthcare services that we receive, and then public or private can also refer to the delivery of it, right? So what is the structure of the actual clinic or the hospital or the surgical center that's actually delivering and administering the services? So when we talk about financing, right, we're talking about who's paying for the services. So if it's publicly financed, it means it's the government that's paying for it through tax revenue. And if it's privately financed, it's either out of pocket, right? You're paying on your credit card, et cetera, or you have a private insurance plan that you're using to pay for services, right? And we're kind of familiar with this, you know, for outpatient prescription drugs, for physio, a lot of people depend on private financing. Depending on where you live, you can qualify for the public plan, whereas for doctors and hospitals, it's mostly publicly financed. So that's who pays. But when we talk about delivery, it's different, right? Delivery is what is the structure of the actual hospital or the clinic itself. You can have public delivery, which means the government owns and operates the hospital. Everyone who works there are employees of the government. But in Canada, we don't actually have that. Most of what we have is private delivery, but here's the key point. It's private, not-for-profit delivery, right? That's how our hospitals are. A lot of the family medicine clinics that people go to are technically for-profit small businesses, right? It's like, you can think of it like your local coffee shop or your local, you know, hardware store. But I think the really sharp contrast to that, and what we talk about when we talk about private delivery and privatization in delivery, are these, you know, large for-profit corporations that are owned by shareholders, that are owned by investors. You know, it's like your local coffee shop versus Starbucks. It's about your local convenience store versus like Circle K, which is this, you know, huge American conglomerate that is now running a lot of the convenience stores in our gas stations. So when we talk about healthcare privatization, when we talk about financing, we're talking about private financing, right? So user fees, out-of-pocket spending, private insurance. When we're talking about delivery, when it's really, we're about moving from not-for-profit to for-profit delivery, where it's the investors, right, who are the bottom line, not patients, and it can lead to all sorts of problems like cream skimming and other things. And the reason it's confusing with this case is because the Cambie case, the Cambie Clinic is a for-profit, investor-owned surgical center, but that is not the court challenge they were fighting. They were fighting for the right to be able to bill patients directly for services. So yes, they're a for-profit clinic, but the legal case was not about their ability to make profit or not. The legal case was about their ability to charge patients for care, which of course would help them make more money. But it's the financing piece that's key here. Okay, I hope I haven't lost too many people. But this is the part where I'm going to hand it over to Usman, and he's going to talk a little bit more about the details of the case itself.
It's Shirley again. I'm just going to introduce our next speaker. Usman Mushtaq is the coordinator of the British Columbia Health Coalition, who are also intervening in this court case. Thank you, Usman, for all of that amazing work from 2008 on, and for joining us from across the country. So you apparently are unmuted, so go ahead.
Thanks, Shirley. It's early here. It's 8 a.m. So please excuse me for if I'm confused about anything. So I'm going to share my slides here, and hopefully that works. And I do have a 1-year-old, and so you might hear him in the background sometimes. He's very vocal about his support of public health care. So, okay, hopefully this works. Can everyone see my screen and hear me? Yeah, okay, great. So I just want to emphasize that while I'm speaking to this decision, really it's been, like Shirley said, a decade of work. There's been many staff, there's been many folks in our coalition who've really put in a lot of time and energy into this over the last decade. So I'm mostly here just to deliver the good news, which is pretty good. Pretty good job. But I think it's been a lot of time and effort by folks in our coalition over the last decade to get here and to get to this point. So, so first of all, thank you for having us. I just also want to mention that our one of our co-chairs, Edith McHattie, was planning on being here but couldn't make it, so she does send her regrets. So. And then the last thing I'll say is that, this is a BC based case, but as you can see, really this is national in scope. And so we've had a lot of support from BC based labor unions and community organizations, but really it's also national organizations and folks based all over the country. So thank you to all of you who've been supporting us in big ways and small ways across the country. So yeah, so like Shirley said, and Danyaal referred to, we've been doing work on this over the last decade, and with our friends over at Canadian Doctors for Medicare, we've been co-intervenors in the case. There's no doubt that our intervention in the case weighed heavily in the verdict. We're actually referenced over 60 times in the verdict, and that's both CDM and the BCHC, like the evidence our experts presented and that our intervention was able to bring up. So, we played a major role in the verdict, which I'll get into later, and the strength of the verdict. So I think that's something we can be happy about. In addition to the legal case, we've been active in BC and nationally, doing media work, engaging with the public. We've been holding webinars on CANBI. We've been engaging with community organizations and union leadership around CANBI. So really, it's not just a legal piece we've been working on. It's also the public engagement and the media piece. And really, it's the strength of our coalition here in BC and the strength of our working relationship with CDM that we've been able to do this work over the last decade. So, like Danyaal said, and as many of you know, the good news is that we won, and we won in pretty certain terms. Justice Steeves in his decision writes, the evidence demonstrates that there are valid concerns that duplicative private healthcare would have the effect of increasing demand for healthcare, as well as overall healthcare costs, while reducing capacity in the public system. And so I'll mention a couple other things about the decision in the next few slides, but I really wanted to start with this quote from the ruling, because one of the major reasons that Day and his supporters use about why they brought this case is around wait times, and Justice Steeves in pretty certain terms writes that this would do nothing to help wait times, and in fact would make them worse in the public system. So that's something we need to remember as we're talking about this case, but also something that and I'll mention this later in my presentation, something we need to think about as far as also what can we do to reduce wait times in the public system, but because that is work we need to do. So let's take a step back, and before I go further into talking about the decision, let's remind ourselves what this case was about. And Danyaal referred to a couple of things, but basically these were the particular sections of the Medicare Protection Act being challenged. And the Medicare Protection Act is a provincial implementation of the CHA, the Canadian Health Act. And the particular sections that were being challenged had to do with limits on limits on extra billing, private insurance, and the ability of doctors to double bill the public system and the private system, and for them to be able to opt out and opt in. And so the particular, like for example, with section 14, what was being challenged is that the physician cannot bill both the patient and the public system for the same service, which is essentially what Day has been doing, for the past decade and probably longer. And so these were some of the sections being challenged, and these are pretty key sections to be challenged. And the reason for that is because these sections are connected to the Canada Health Act. This provincial law, the Medicare Protection Act, is also designed to be consistent with the Canada Health Act, and that includes the ban on extra billing and extra user fees. So if these were struck down at the BC level, these could have impacted and will impact the Canada Health Act as well. The last part there says, no matter what the decision is this summer, this case is almost certain to advance to the Supreme Court of Canada. That's a bit outdated. We know what the decision was this summer, but we also know that this case will certainly advance to the Supreme Court of Canada. And we've already seen the first steps happen in the continuation of the case, which I'll talk about later on in this presentation. So if we lose, or if we had lost, what would have happened? We'd have seen that basically Canada's Medicare system would transform into a US-style system. We share a border with the US. We know that, there's already concerns about American healthcare companies and American pharmaceutical companies moving in into Canada, and the American healthcare companies spent nearly $568 million in lobbying in 2018 alone, more than any other industry in the US. At the same time, we see that the weight of Canadian and international research shows that private financing increases wait times for those waiting in the public system. So, you know, we would have ended, and we still might if the case doesn't go successfully for us, with a US-style two-tier system, where there's a public system that's degraded and a private system that's only accessible to those who have the ability to pay.
Usman, it's Shirley. I'm so sorry. We are running about 10 minutes late. I am not a relative of Brian Day. I just wanted you to know I'm not the devil in this. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll just speak quickly about the decision then. So, the decision was 880 pages long. It was our lawyer said it was one of the longest decisions the BC Supreme Court has ever written. There was a way to sum up that decision. It would be in paragraph 15, where Justice Steeves writes, the introduction of duplicative private healthcare would increase demand for public care, reduce the capacity of the public system, and create incentives for physicians, perverse incentives for physicians like double billing and extra billing. So we would basically end up with a second tier of healthcare that's based on a person's ability to pay. Some of the key takeaways, which I'll let people kind of read, are basically that the evidence, this is what we want people to know, stepping from the decision, is that private healthcare would not reduce wait times. Private financing of healthcare would only benefit the wealthy and healthy, and privately financed healthcare undermines equitable access to care. And so hopefully there's a way to share this presentation, and I will do so, and then folks can look through some of these other key points.
We'll send it out, Usman, to everyone after the meeting. Thank you. Also, This is being recorded and will be up online. Great.
So I know I'm running out of time, so I'll just talk a bit about the next steps. Day and his supporters have already filed for a moratorium on Justice Steeves' decision. So what they're seeking is non-enforcement of the decision that was passed, because they want to keep doing the practices they've been doing for the last decade. And they've also filed a notice of appeal, and the appeal is scheduled to be heard in June of next year. So we're already, getting ready for that. So yeah, please stay tuned. We'll roll out a media campaign and a public action campaign based on the appeal, and we hope the appeal will go well for us. But yeah, let's see. We're back in the courts, and like I said, it's likely going to the Supreme Court of Canada.
Thank you, Usman, so much. We really were quite taken with your presentation. Thank you. Thank you. Going as fast as I can. Dr. Gordon Guyatt is a distinguished professor of clinical epidemiology and biostatistics from McMaster University. He is also a board member of the Ontario Health Coalition and has contributed enormously to the work amongst physicians for healthcare reform in the public interest. He also participated in the private clinics file. Thank you, Dr. Guyatt. We are pleased to have you join us today. You're now unmuted.
Yes, I am unmuted, I hope. I understand that we are behind, and mine is just to extend a personal story. So I'm going to kind of whip through a bit because I think the question and answer is important. So I'm going to tell the story. I was the last witness to be called by the government, and a little bit about what happened in terms of preparation of the issues, the testimony, and I've been asked to talk about, I was pushed to talk about a little bit about how we could deal with wait times. I'm going to tell one thing that I kind of know about, which I think people should know, which is the misleading presentations you often hear about the finances of healthcare. So, last expert witness called by the governor, I was asked because the Canby lawyers had put forward expert testimony that they wanted me to try and rebut. And it was specifically this. Clearly, it's a problem, say you're going to get a hip replacement. It's a problem if you have to wait 6 months and you undergo the pain of the 6 months. But the question is, if after the pain of 6 months or a year, you get your hip replaced, are there any long-term adverse consequences, bad things that happen because you had to wait? So that's what they asked me. And the Canby expert said, yes, if you have to wait 6 months or a year, not only did you suffer for 6 months or a year, but the long-term outcomes of your hip replacement are not going to be as good. And they asked me whether I thought whether the evidence really supported that statement by the Canby lawyers. You've already heard how long the thing went on. I was first contacted and had my preparation 2 years in advance, prepared my brief to them, and then waited 2 years to testify. So my preparation felt like I was back in university. I had 60 papers that were cited. Karen Palmer, who some of you may know, who was did a good job as helping out the government defense, told me about a prior witness on our side who hadn't looked carefully about all the papers he cited, and it was sort of embarrassing. So I decided I'd better know them really well. So that was a lot of studying that I hadn't done since university. On the day before my testimony, I spent a whole day with the lawyers in Vancouver, where we talked about the best approach I should address. So the question was, the studies that were brought by Brian Day's expert witnesses said, oh, you have long-term bad consequences as a result of waiting. And what's the credibility of that evidence? I thought it was low credibility, and that was what I was testifying for. So first of all, when you're testifying, you first get questioning by your own lawyer. So basically, this is a setup to get me to be able to present everything that they wanted me to present. And the first thing is your credentials. You have to convince them that you're a real expert. After that, we went through a mini course in research methods for the judge. So we explained to him the concept of what we call confounding. Think of this. People go in hospital and you ask, do people do well in hospital, or do they do badly? Is hospital a good thing or a bad thing? And you find out going to the hospital, many more people die when you go to the hospital. Clearly, hospitals are dangerous places. And if you want to do well, you'd better avoid going to a hospital. So everybody laughs at that, because we all know that the reason you go to hospital is you're very sick. It's not that hospitals are dangerous places. It's that you're very sick. And it's the same here. People who may have bad outcomes over the long term, the people who waited may be sicker than the people who didn't wait, in the same way people who go to the hospital are sicker than people who don't. And for instance, two people I know who had hip replacement. One was a healthy 60-year-old firefighter who was limited in her job. Another, an 89-year-old who was limited in her housework and had chronic illnesses. The surgeons will operate much more quickly on the first one than the second one. The first one is destined to do better than the second one. So it's not that the weight made the difference. It's that they select different patients. Surgeons will prioritize people who are going to do better. So that's basically the case I made. And I also pointed out to him that ideally we would have, how would you get around this problem of confounding, that the surgeons are selecting different people to go early and different people to go late? Well, we have what we call randomized trials, where you randomize people, and that makes our groups very balanced in the likelihood of their outcomes. And it turns out that randomized trials often contradict earlier studies. And at the moment, we're seeing, for instance, with COVID, you had early studies suggesting hydroxychloroquine was a great drug. pushed by various people, including the US president, where it turns out you do the randomized trials, the stuff is useless and probably harmful. So as it turns out, I was able to find 3 randomized trials of waitlist where you randomize people to go early or late. Then you get around this confounding problem. They were for hip, knee, and back surgery. All told said long-term outcomes are the same, right? So when you do this, when you do the optimal studies, the long-term outcomes are the same. And I was gratified that I thought I got the message through to the judge, because periodically somebody would mention a study and he would say, "Was this a randomized trial?" So then I thought we got the message through. Okay, so I now go through cross-examination. The first hours was spent attacking my credibility. Why? Because I'm a board member of the Ontario Health Coalition. And so they said, how can a board member of the Ontario Health Coalition speak objectively about this? I'm clearly biased. It went on for a couple of hours. I think the judge got fed up with this. Eventually, there was a legal dispute on admissible evidence. And I never got to actually, on the first day, which was supposed to be my only day, I never got to say what I actually came there to say. Had to cancel my flight back, come back the next day, spend the whole morning doing what I was supposed to do. Now, there was a reporter from a Vancouver newspaper who had decided they liked Dr. Day. They were Dr. Day supporters. And everything that this particular journalist wrote was always supporting Dr. Day. But I was pleased when he reported on my testimony. I was, of course, attacked by the Day lawyer. He said, I gave as good as I got. And that pleased me. Okay, so that's my experience as an expert witness. The last thing I want to do is briefly talk about how we can reduce waiting lists. Clearly, we want to be more efficient, and there's efficient prioritization, but it needs the operating room time. You cannot, no matter how efficiently you prioritize, if you don't have the operating time, you can't do it. And you may still be hearing that healthcare costs are out of control. How do we look at our healthcare costs appropriately? We look at it in relation to our gross domestic product. And if you look between 1975 and now, there have been upward trends in healthcare. The gold line is the total, the blue line is public. Look at the last decade, essentially flat. If anything, on the public expenditures, the healthcare slightly down. As a percentage of our national wealth, healthcare costs are the farthest thing from being out of control. The last decade, they are flat. Some people at least are beginning to realize this. There may be some people still saying healthcare costs are out of control, but just like you have to measure how much can you spend in your house or car, whatever, it depends on your income. And it's similar for our country in terms of a proportion of our income. Healthcare costs have been flat. So why, if there's a problem, is there any problem? And that's depicted in this slide. If you go back to 1990, particularly the federal government was spending 22% of our gross domestic product, big public expenditures. In the blue line, which is the provincial, about 21. So overall, we were spending 43% of our national wealth every year on public expenditures. What's happened in the subsequent 30 years? It has gone down, particularly look at the federal. We've gone from about 22 to 15% of our GDP. How'd that happen? Tax cuts. This is tax cuts. What tax cuts mean is we are moving our expenditures from the less public expenditure, more private expenditure, and that of course constrains all public expenditures in terms of healthcare. Bottom lines, we have the money to spend on healthcare. For instance, in increasing operating room time as a way to decrease waiting lists. One, our healthcare spending as a percentage of GDP is stable over the last decade. Secondly, those tax cuts have had their cost. Healthcare is as sustainable as we want it to be. So I've tried to catch us up a little bit. I hope I have at least not made the situation worse, and very happy to go to question and answer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Guyatt. We really enjoyed your presentation. Now we are going to have our Q&A now. Numerous people wanted to know if Dr. Day would be required to pay back all of the money that he double billed for.
Who
And
should
that can
answer
go
that?
to anyone.
Danielle, why don't you
Yeah.
start?
Yeah. So the court decision clearly found that what he was doing was illegal. So the funds do need to be recouped. Now the question, you know, I'm a little bit hedgy because what he's also done now, in addition to launching an appeal to the case itself, is his team has also filed what's called an injunction to basically get permission to keep on operating, saying that, well, the appeal could go our way. So until we know for sure, we should keep being able to do what we did, which is what they did prior to this decision. And the judge granted them the injunction. So what they're basically doing is they're going to keep on filing these injunctions, hoping it'll go their way, and try to keep operating. Because my assumption is if they have to pay everything back, they're going to go out of business. So I think they're just really trying to use the legal system to keep going. I don't know how this judge is going to rule. It's a different judge who's going to rule on the injunction than is the judge who ruled on the injunction the first time around when it was in front of the other court. So, you know, hopefully if we keep winning at every stage, he will have to pay it back, but he's going to try and delay it as much as he can.
Just one point about the injunction. The injunction the first time, they didn't have a ruling in front of them. And as both prior speakers pointed out, this was a very strong decision. This wasn't just, oh, I think that it's the right thing. This was a slam dunk in terms of the decision. And whoever makes the injunction will be looking at that and hopefully say, boy, this strong decision, they should at least, aside from the payback, they at least should not be continuing this.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Sarah would like to know, she's thinking ahead. Despite the Canby case not being definitely finished, do you think there are other things that we should be looking forward to? She cites Bill 30 in Alberta. And we were wondering if Dr. Raza could begin to speak a little bit about that.
And Usman also.
And Guzman also.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. So there's an op-ed I wrote with another board member who's an emergency doctor in Red Deer on Bill 30. So you can click the link and you can read more there. But you know, one of the differences between Bill 30 and this case is about financing, and Bill 30 is about taking public dollars and basically contracting out to for-profit care. You know, for-profit surgical centers and other for-profit institutions. And we know, thanks to actually a lot of the research that Gordon does. So I will give a shout out to Gordon right here, because Gordon's evidence, I think, has been and research has not just been so foundational in this case, but I think foundational to building the evidence base and support of our public healthcare system in Canada. So Gordon, a very public thank you for all of the work you've done on that and your meta-analysis, which are the expression is escaping me, but verse here, at least in my academic background. So yeah, Bill 30 is very much about delivery. And I think, you know, those of us in Ontario should be paying attention, because Doug Ford and Jason Kenney are, you know, cut from the same ideological cloth. And I'm looking to see what's happening in Alberta as hints as to where Doug Ford may go. So I think in Ontario, we should definitely be paying attention to what's happening in Alberta, in addition to this court case in BC.
Usman? Yeah, so, and I want to emphasize that, you know, this is not just an Alberta problem, but even in BC, earlier this year to catch up to the elective surgery backlog that increased here in BC due to the pandemic. The government made the decision to use for-profit clinics, including days clinics. So, you know, it was quite like on one hand, we're fighting this case against day. On the other hand, the government is actually like giving out contracts to days clinic and clinics like Days Clinic to deal with the surgical backlog, and we launched an action against that decision, and had some talks with the Minister of Health's office. But this is something we need to just keep an eye out for, and we're seeing this in virtual health as well with TELUS, with Maple, where it is becoming about for-profit delivery of care and sneaking into our system. And so we really need to be aware and keep an eye out for this. And so I think, you know, the Canby decision is not only a strong decision for this particular, like for the particular case we're fighting, but I think could serve as a landmark decision on other issues as well. So so yeah, I think, you know, we just need to be constantly pushing back where we can.
Thank you. Jim wants to know from Dr. Guyatt, how can we efficiently prioritize in the current climate? Can you expand, please?
Well, I'm an evidence-based guy. I think we should look at the evidence as to what works. Look at the evidence of which ways to deliver healthcare more efficiently. We know that there's a lot of waste in the healthcare system. There's a lot of things we're doing that shouldn't be done at all, some that should be done more efficiently. So what we should be doing is looking to the evidence to try and make our healthcare more efficient.
Actually, I have a question, sorry. I'm just wondering on the point of increasing efficiency, wouldn't that be helped? I'm not sure it would solve the problem, but helped if healthcare were funded properly. Like we've been through 25 years of austerity in Ontario. And the wait times, I think, come about because, you know, people have had, or hospitals have had to close beds and close ORs. And so there is, there is the possibility of increasing efficiency if we had the tools to work with, or is that not true?
Well, you have to be careful. So if you go back 40 years, we were spending much more as a percentage of our healthcare system and hospitals than we are now. That, in fact, was inefficient. And a lot of what's happened in the last 40 years is we've developed all sorts of ways of doing care as outpatients rather than in hospital. And that has actually, for instance, laparoscopic surgery rather than open surgery, it not only makes things more efficient, patients are actually better off for that. So simply having more resources can be badly spent. People can make wrong decisions. Governments can, frankly, start paying doctors too much. That is one way. The government has money, doctors make a fuss, doctors get paid more. That does not improve the efficiency of the system. It's not, so I completely agree with you. And so if you're talking about wait times, one thing that's happened in Ontario, there previously were huge wait times for surgery when people have heart attacks or have bad heart disease. They're not open surgery, but surgical-like procedures, catheterizations to put in stents and deal with problems that way. There used to be huge wait times. Government puts in a lot of money. Now patients can get these procedures very quickly. That's great. However, money can be poorly spent. So just having more money does not guarantee efficiency. The money Certainly, in many cases, we do need more money. What you pointed out about excessive constraints is absolutely right, but we have to make sure the money is spent in a way that is most productive. It should be spent efficiently.
Thank you. And there's one last question here to the panel. Could you describe, oh, there now something's happened. Could you describe the deep pockets that are actually bankrolling Brian Day? I'm not sure they're all Canadian, but I could be wrong. So Dr. Guyatt, could you?
Well, I asked, so the person who is, my impression is best informed about sort of details about the situation is this Karen Palmer, who was employed by the defense, by the BC government, and knows all the ins and outs. And I asked her this very question just a few days ago, and she said, wouldn't you like to know? I would too. It is not as I say, I have the impression she's the most authoritative person on the whole thing. Nobody knows who's, as I understand it, nobody knows who's funding Brian Day.
Maybe Donald Trump.
Usman has, I think, some info on that.
Yes, Usman?
Yeah, so, a couple of years ago, Press Progress did a report, and I posted the link in the chat, but, one of the major supporters and major donors and really like the major people working with Day on this case are the Canadian Constitutional Foundation. And they're a right-wing group that's funded by, they're part of a network that's funded by the Koch brothers from the US. They also have connections through staff to Kenny and the Conservative Party, and so we can imagine there some financing from those circles. So this is a very much an ideological fight for them, and they have the money and the financing to fund it. And they have pretty deep pockets. The Health Coalition is a pretty small organization, as is, I know, CDM, and so we're definitely punching above our weight in this case, and so I think that's why it's so important. We have your support and in every way, but especially financially, especially as we're heading towards these higher levels of court.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank our panelists this morning. I know that we've all learned so much and are better advocates of public health care because of you.